In December 1944, the German army was in serious trouble. In the east, the Soviets were in a headlong advance towards the borders of the Reich. To the south, the combined Anglo-American forces were driving Germans up the boot of Italy. And in Western Europe, the thinly stretched defenders were hastily reorganising behind the Siegfried Line following their retreat from Normandy. Nevertheless, Hitler still had dreams of a turnaround. Mustering his last reinforcements, and backed with the scattering of high-quality new armoured units, including the formidable King Tiger tank, he would roll the dice one final time in the forests of the Ardennes. That winter on the Belgian-German border, the battle-weary Allies drew breath. Some units had fought non-stop since June. Others, only just arriving in theatre, were completely untested in battle. Now, as Christmas approached, those divisions occupying the quiet sector around the Ardennes found themselves directly in the path of the last major German offensive of the war on the Western Front. Amongst them were the men of the 394th Infantry Regiment Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, who would soon cement their place in World War II legend. The men of the INR were hand-picked, chosen for their intelligence, observation skills, marksmanship, motivation and physical fitness. Their role was a dangerous one: to advance ahead of the larger infantry formations, patrol, gather intelligence, and in essence to act as the eyes and ears of their parent regiment. Led by 20-year-old Lieutenant Lyle Balk, it consisted of 2 9-man squads and a 7-man headquarters section. Balk's already challenging role was made all the more daunting by the fact that he was the second youngest man in the entire platoon. By December 1944, the 394th found themselves occupying a sector a few miles inside the Belgian border, close to the Ardennes forest. Balk and his men had spent their first weeks in combat patrolling an unoccupied area to the south of their sector and monitoring the German positions across no man's land. But by December they'd been told to take up a defensive position in the line whilst waiting the arrival of new units. Their dispositions were roughly as follows. The area they were assigned was on the slopes to the northwest of the small village of Lanzerath, overlooking the village itself and the main north-south road which passed through it. The road itself was the major prize. About a mile to the north it met another major highway which offered a fast route westwards for armour and vehicles. In the event of an attack, this road, with its potential access behind the Allied lines, must be held at all costs. In order to defend the road, Balk had to make best possible use of his command. His major line of resistance would be along this wood line, with his men occupying and improving on previously dug foxholes, spaced out over some 450 yards and greatly aided in their concealment by fresh snowfall. The men located here were also supported by a jeep-mounted 50 caliber machine gun, which was dug in to cover the main road, a 30 caliber machine gun and several Browning automatic rifles as well as personal weapons. Further aiding defence was a barbed wire fence running about 4 feet high which crossed the entire front of the position, making an effective obstacle to infantry. In Lanzerath itself, Balk could place a 2-man observation post with views south and east along the likely route of any enemy advance. Nearby, 55 men and 3 towed guns of a tank destroyer battalion and several artillery observers had also set up in the village. In the centre were 2 cafes named Café Palm and Café Schulzen. Both would be important in the battle to come. From the German side of the wire a few miles away, things looked outwardly quiet. Having fallen back to the once formidable Siegfried Line, the position of which can still be traced by its famous dragon's teeth, it seemed sure that both sides would settle down in the sector and wait out the winter snows. All that was soon to change. Largely unknown to US intelligence, the Germans amassed 2 formidable panzer armies opposite an 80-mile stretch of the Western Front in the Ardennes. Their aim was to launch a surprise thrust through the forest, seizing vital bridges and rail junctions before driving on to capture the major Allied supply hub of Antwerp some 100 miles away, thus splitting the Allied forces and setting back their progress by months at the least. It was a massively ambitious plan, relying on the capture of enemy fuel supplies and maintaining a very strict timetable. Speed was the key. Advancing in the northern thrust of those two armies would be the men of the 6th SS Panzer Army, spearheaded by Kampfgruppe Peiper, named for its formidable leader, Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper. Arguably one of Germany's most ruthless and effective panzer commanders in World War II, Peiper had earned a fearsome reputation on the Eastern Front, receiving the Knight's Cross with oak leaves from Hitler himself. His task was simple: push on, drive through the enemy lines, sweeping away resistance in a race to capture two vital bridges across the Amblev and Meuse rivers before the Americans could reinforce the natural defensive bastions. Time was everything. Supporting Peiper in this role were several key infantry units whose job was to advance ahead of the armoured column and clear the way through the Allied front lines to allow a swift passage. Tasked with clearing the 23-house village of Lanzerath and the key crossroads to its north were the men of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger and 27th Volksgrenadier Divisions. Earlier in the war, considered amongst the elite of German forces, the 3rd Fallschirmjäger had been badly mauled in Normandy and now possessed a mix of hardened veterans and new recruits. Nevertheless, the 1,200 or so men of its 9th Regiment should have had no problem brushing aside the handful of US forces around the village. And so, at 5:30 am on the 16th of December 1944, Lyle Bauck and his men were jolted into wakefulness by the opening of an intense barrage heralding the start of Operation Wacht am Rhein. Bauck himself remembered the moment.
We felt that there was something going on over there, but didn't realize the magnitude of what it was going to be. The shelling surprised us. The area in front of us was being hit, but then they moved it up to just short of our position, and I thought we were gonna get it next, but then it moved behind us. Then it started again, and they kept repeating that for I don't know how long, but a long time. When this continued on and on, I thought this isn't just some spoiling fire, this is something much bigger. Within about 45 minutes, the first Germans appeared.
Shaken but largely unharmed by the bombardment, the men of the INR steeled themselves for the inevitable infantry assault. With the tank destroyer unit in Lanzerath recalled to the rear to regroup, it only left Bauck's own 2-man outpost in the village, and that in imminent danger of being overrun. Understanding the risk, he sent a 3-man patrol under Corporal McGee to rescue those in the village, but by the time they reached the road they found it swarming with Germans. Forced away to the north, they were engaged in a bitter firefight and later captured. Although Sergeant Slape and Corporal Krieger of the outpost position, who had hidden amongst some cows in a nearby barn, were able to make it back and rejoin the remainder of the platoon, which was also bolstered about the same time by 4 artillerymen, making the total number in the wood line above Lanzerath 22. At around 9:30 am, some 500 men of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment were seen advancing north in full view along the main road parallel to Bauck's position at a distance of some 400 yards. The INR men held their fire as the range closed all the time. It was considerable surprise moments later when a young girl was seen leaving the northernmost houses of the village, pointing directly towards the position of hitherto unseen Americans, possibly informing the Germans of their presence. Immediately an order was shouted, and as the Germans exposed on the roadway began running for cover, Bauck gave the order to open fire. A hail of small arms fire fell directly into the deploying column, causing numerous casualties. A prolonged firefight developed, with Germans shooting from roadside ditches and the small group on the hill firing back with rifles and their 2 machine guns. Despite the intense fire, only 1 INR man was wounded, although dozens of Germans fell before they retreated into the village. At around 11 am, once again a company of Fallschirmjäger was seen advancing directly toward the wood in a frontal assault. Bauck recalled what happened next.
They came up this hill in a line of skirmishers, and when they reached the fence, we just fired on them. It was kind of like a manslaughter. This went on for maybe 8 minutes. Finally, it stopped and everything quieted down. I remember what that looked like in the snow. It's hard to imagine.
As the devastating effect of the American fire from well-protected positions became clear, the surviving Germans withdrew to the cover of the road around 11:45 am, leaving a high tide mark of fallen at the fence running in front of the American position. It wouldn't be the last attack. At approximately 3 PM, Bauck was surprised to see yet another frontal assault develop against their positions, this time with larger numbers and with heavier supporting fire. The result was the same. The platoon's jeep-mounted 50 caliber machine gun, firing across the line of advance, took a horrific toll on the attackers, as did the accurate fire from the foxholes. German paratrooper Rudi Frühbeiser recalled the moment.
Here there's lying snow on the ground, and the paratroopers in their model smocks really stand out. When the third company approaches the houses, Zugführer Schiele stumbles and does not get up. When somebody turns him over, he concludes, headshot. Meyer and Schmidt are wounded less severely. Medic Mathieu walks to the wounded. He is clearly recognizable with the red cross on his chest. As he's treating the wounded, there's a shot. He grabs his face and keels over. Headshot. Then Smith turns around to help. He's also hit by a headshot.
Examining survivors' accounts of this particular moment strongly suggests that INR's Private Milosevic was the man firing at this time, as it was later reported that he detected a medic leaning over a wounded soldier talking into a communications device. Shortly afterwards, mortar fire began landing close to his position, and so Milosevic opened fire. Whatever the truth in the fog of war, it was clear that this was a bitter and desperate fight. By now, the sheer weight of German fire was taking its toll. Several men had been slightly wounded, others more seriously, with Private Khalil being hit full in the face by a rifle grenade which failed to explode, lacerating his face and driving his broken teeth into the roof of his mouth. The pressure increased, and whilst the men on the ridge held their own, their last communications were destroyed. The 50 caliber machine gun disabled, and ammunition was growing perilously short. Bauck, now with several wounded, and all his men cold, scared and exhausted, and facing over 1,000 enemy infantry, resolved to hold out till dusk before attempting to retreat back towards friendly lines. 2 men were sent in the direction of regimental headquarters requesting a formal withdrawal order. Neither would make it. Back down in Lanzerath village, at the Café Schulzen, the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regimental Commander Oberst von Hoffmann, frustrated and unsure of the enemy strength on the hill, was concerned about the loss of time. With Kampfgruppe Peiper en route and expecting the area to be secured, he resolved to launch one more assault against the hard-pressed and enormously outnumbered defenders. This time moving through Lanzerath village to get around the right of the American line and roll up the INR men from flank and rear. Back on the hill, Bauck and his men were nervously waiting for dark, husbanding their last few rounds and tending the wounded. Sadly, time had run out. Just as the sun set over Lanzerath, a strong German attack burst into the tree line from their exposed flank. Bauck himself described what happened next.
They hit us from the right side and came out of Lanzerath. We didn't know they were there. The only thing I remember was looking out the back of the foxhole we were in, and I saw some motion to the right side of the platoon, and knew it wasn't my guys out there, so I started firing at these figures. Moments later, the barrel of a gun came into the hole, and I pushed Sakanikis, and as I did that, whoever had the weapon opened up, and it hit Sak in the right side of the face. The next thing I remember, it seemed like there wasn't any firing going on. At that time, I thought about my Aunt Mildred. She was a palm reader. She had told me when we were back in St. Louis, if you lived to be 21, you were going to have a long life. So, I had a few hours to go.
Taken into captivity along with the remnants of his platoon and marched into Lanzerath village a prisoner of the Germans, Lyle Bauck lived to see his 21st birthday and began a long and brutal journey back to a prisoner of war camp where he and his men would remain for the rest of the war. All told, Bauck's small command had lost just one man killed, Private Billy Queen, shot whilst firing from his foxhole, though 14 of his men were wounded. The 9th Fallschirmjäger probably left some 30 dead on the slopes above Lanzerath, and perhaps as many as 100 wounded. The real success though was measured not in the casualty toll inflicted on the enemy, but in time. The INR platoon had held up a vastly superior enemy for more than 12 hours, and even after their capture that evening, the Germans would not continue their advance, believing that the ferocity of resistance they had met throughout the day must have come from a much larger force. In this alone, the INR materially contributed to the failure of Kampfgruppe Peiper to break through the American lines and cross the River Meuse. The final gamble in the West, due to men like Lyle Balk, did not pay off. In the months and years following the actions on the Lanzerath Ridge, the story of what passed there that December day was largely forgotten. The survivors went home and continued with their lives, rarely speaking about the war. It was not until several decades later that the story rose to prominence as authors and historians began to piece together the actions of that day. And it wasn't until 1981, following a series of high-profile appeals, that the platoon as a whole was recognised with the Presidential Unit Citation for heroism and individual awards for valour given to each man, namely the Distinguished Service Cross to Lieutenant Lyle Balk and 3 others, 5 Silver Stars and 9 Bronze Stars with Valour Device, thus making the men of the 394th Infantry Regiment's INR platoon the most highly decorated American platoon for a single action in the entire Second World War. So that ends this battle guide video, which I hope you enjoyed and found interesting. Of course, if you'd like to see more, be sure to check out our other videos right here on YouTube. And for the real history lovers, why not check out battleguide.co.uk, where each week we combine the latest technology with the world's leading historians to deliver a live virtual tour of the world's most spectacular battlefields. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.